Thank you, everybody, for coming to the College Football Betting with Aaron Torres YouTube channel. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little subscribe button at the bottom of the screen. Go ahead, click that subscribe button. It helps our channel grow. It helps our audience grow. I appreciate it more than you know as we're talking college football on this channel year round. Appreciate your support. Click that subscribe button. This is the one, 3:30 Eastern, 2:30 Central, Georgia at Ole Miss. Ole Miss is a 2.5-point home underdog. Georgia, a 2.5-point favorite. The over-under set at 54.5. And I mentioned it a minute ago. But you know who's not happy with this start time? Lane freaking Kiffin, okay? Lane freaking Kiffin was furious 2 weeks ago when this was announced. You know, he made the whole thing about the fans don't get a home SEC game. I think Lane Kiffin knows that crowd's just going to be rowdier and louder if you could get them at 6:30 Central Time instead of 2:30 Central Time. But it is what it is, and Ole Miss is going to have to make it work. From this game's perspective, I want to start with Georgia, okay? And Georgia survived Florida last week. But if you watch that game, it was tied in the fourth quarter. It was a game that if DJ Lagway doesn't get hurt, I think there's a pretty good possibility that Georgia ends up losing that game to Florida. And while we're on the subject of Georgia, can we take a half a second? This show's a safe space, right? I can just say what I feel all the time. We can all be honest with each other. Carson Beck hasn't been very good. Like something's not right with Carson Beck. Either he's regressed, there's some sort of injury we don't know about. Maybe Brock Bowers, we relied on him more than we thought. But the bottom line is he has not been good. And if you watch that Georgia Florida game last week, 3 interceptions in that game. Kirby Smart kind of lit into him on the sideline. I'll be honest. I think if there was a better backup option, I think Kirby Smart might have gone to it. I know Gunnar Stockton's good, whatever. But at the same time, if Dylan Raiola is on that roster like he was supposed to be, I think that might have been Dylan Raiola time. If Brock Vandagriff hadn't left for Kentucky, I think it might have been Brock Vandagriff time. And you really got the sense. I think Kirby was about one possession away from pulling Carson Beck. He did not. Carson Beck does enough to lead Georgia to the victory. But it doesn't change the fact that that quarterback situation has not been good. And Carson Beck, there's no other way to put it other than that he has regressed this year. And we've talked about, listen, I don't want to pat myself on the back too much here. I've been all over this since pretty much after the Kentucky game or maybe the Alabama game. I can't remember. He was good against Alabama, but he really wasn't that good. He wasn't good against Texas. And here's the truth. First off, the numbers just back up. He hasn't been as good. Last year, 72% completion percentage, 24 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. This year, 65% completion percentage, 17 touchdowns, 11 interceptions. But let's go back to what we talked about last week, is that if you take out the Auburn and Mississippi State games in which Carson Beck padded his stats, he has not been very good in the biggest games against the best defenses. Against Florida last week, 25 of 40. That's a 62% completion percentage, 309 yards, 2 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Against Texas, we all remember Texas as this great win. Wasn't a great game for Carson Beck. 23 of 41, 56% completion percentage, 0 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Against Alabama, we remember it, this amazing game. Carson Beck, 54% completion percentage, 3 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. So you take out Mississippi State and Alabama. You go to the last 3 games, Florida, Texas, and Alabama, the 3 better defenses compared to Mississippi State and Auburn. That is, if my math is correct, 5 touchdowns, 5 touchdowns. Yeah, 5 touchdowns. And how about this? 9 interceptions. Florida, Texas, Alabama. 5 touchdowns, 9 interceptions for Carson Beck. He has not been good. And let me take it a step further. The run game has not been good either for Georgia, 97th nationally. And Trevor Etienne, by the way, is dealing with a rib injury. Kirby Smart says he expects him to play. Doesn't change the fact that he's going to be pretty banged up coming into this game. So that's Georgia. Good news for Georgia. Defense has been really good. And I think because the offense has struggled, I think we're maybe underselling how talented that defense is. I went back and looked it up, statistically top 30 defense in rush and pass. But here's the crazy part. Georgia, go ahead and look at that. They're giving up 17 points per game, 17.3 points per game. Okay. Take out the Alabama game where they basically were just awful for a half. They're giving up about 13 points per game, which would be like top 5 nationally if you just took out the Bama game. Now, I guess for anybody, if you took out the worst game that they played all year, it'd be one thing. But I just bring it up to say is that defense has been really good. They deserve the credit that they're getting. probably not getting enough credit, frankly, because of the fact that, the offense has kind of struggled. Speaking of defense, let's get to Ole Miss, and let's go ahead and give Lane Kiffin just a half a second of credit here, okay? The offense has always been good. That's never been an issue under Lane Kiffin at any of his stops, USC, Tennessee, the Raiders, Florida Atlantic, Ole Miss, whatever. But in this portal era, he clearly made it a priority. We have to get better, especially up front. And so his priority was in the portal last year on the defensive line. They get Walter Nolan, who's been phenomenal. I actually have my buddy, Carter Bryant, who does some SEC, like breakdowns, some video breakdowns. He brought up this point. He said, could you make the argument that Walter Nolan is the most valuable player in the SEC this year? I don't know that I'm there yet, but think about it. Who else? Who's really in the running? It ain't Quinn Ewers. He's been banged up. It ain't Carson Beck. That's for darn sure. Jalen Milroe has 2 losses. It might be Walter Nolan. It might be that Ole Miss defense, because that Ole Miss run defense has been phenomenal this year with all the guys that they brought in through the portal, and they do deserve some credit because, of course, on top of that, they have some returnees as well that have been pretty good. But on the season, here's what you need to know about Ole Miss's run defense. This is a team that currently ranks number 2 in the country in total rush defense, number 1 in the country in fewest yards per carry. And oh, by the way, on top of that, they have only given up 4 rushing touchdowns. That is top 5 in the country as well. Now, the pass defense been a little bit of hit or miss, okay? Pass defense has been a little bit of hit or miss, 91st nationally. I think some of that is that, there's been a couple games they've been up. They've given up some plays late. I don't think it's that big of a concern, but they are just stymieing everybody along the line of scrimmage. And Lane Kiffin deserves a ton of credit for the guys that he's brought in. And so when I think about this game, I'll be honest, my best bet, I was going to go under. I'm going to explain why in a minute, why I'm not going to. I'm going to take Ole Miss plus 2.5. And I think, frankly, they are winning this game outright. And to me, what did I just mention a minute ago? This is a matchup-based sport, especially in the SEC, especially in this era. It's just teams that there's such a small gap between teams that it's all about matchups, right? I don't think Arkansas is like 40 points worse than Ole Miss, but it was a terrible matchup for Arkansas. Ole Miss stops the run really well. Arkansas wants to run it. Ole Miss passes the ball really well. Arkansas can't stop the pass, and all of a sudden you have a 40-point deficit. Well, coming into this game, Georgia is struggling to run the football. That is indisputable. 97th in the country, 8 games in. That's not a coincidence at this point. It's a trend. Struggling to run the football. And then when you're dropping back to pass, Carson Beck has been reckless with the ball. And so when I look at this game and I break it down, I think Georgia, they'll be able to score points, but I also think there's going to be 2 or 3 times where Carson Beck puts his team in a bad spot. And then to take it a step further, I don't think they're going to be able to run the ball against this team. Put aside, again, what did I say earlier? Put aside all your bias. Put aside all your this, all your that, all your whatever, and just look at the stats. I know it's Georgia. I know they were preseason number 1, maybe the best team in the country last year, even though they didn't make the 12-team playoff. But this year specifically, they cannot run the football at the level that they have previously, and that's bad news going against Ole Miss. Now, when Ole Miss has the football, I will say they need to run the ball more effectively than they have in certain big spots. But again, they've actually run the football better than the stats would indicate. Go back to that game a few weeks ago at LSU. It's easy to forget because of the way the game ended with an Ole Miss loss that they ran the football very effectively in that game. By the way, last week against Arkansas, 132 yards rushing. They were very effective moving the ball on the ground. Oklahoma, very effective moving the ball on the ground, although Oklahoma did a pretty good job shutting them down, a little under 100 yards of rush offense. And so I just bring it up because, listen, I do think Georgia will limit that run game a little bit, but Jackson Dart, all those guys, all those receivers, I'm kind of smelling the Ole Miss upset. So go ahead and give me Ole Miss, take plus the points, plus the 2.5. But I think it's interesting. They open as a 2.5-point underdog. This line has not moved, and Georgia is a very public team. I think Vegas sees what I see, which is an Ole Miss team that is going to give Georgia fits when Ole Miss is on defense as much as they will on offense.